Okay, so this is a nice short one, but it's a really, really important one. There's going to be so many quotes here you can use in your exam. So please make sure you annotate everything on this page, on page 56. So page 56 starts off with the inspector talking about, what Eric did that was wrong. He says the phrase, "you used her." Okay, so used her. Now that really links to the fact that women at the time were so exploited. Mr. Burling's used her for cheap labour. Gerald's used her to sleep with her and then discard her. And Eric has used her to sleep with her and do the same thing. Just for the end of a drunken evening, for his own pleasure. And then he says, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person. So we're talking here about how they've all dehumanized Eva Smith. And I think that's really interesting as well, because the inspector's pointing out, just because someone was different to you, just because they didn't have a lot of money, you treated them like they were an animal. And it really shows that the Burlings aren't treating people like humans. They aren't very human themselves. They don't really have empathy. They don't really have sympathy. And that's a huge issue. And Sheila then says, no, I know, I turned her out of a job. I started it. And Sheila takes blame for herself, but the inspector says, no, you didn't start it. Your father did. So he's saying, stop just blaming yourself, but everyone's to blame here. It's collective responsibility. We're all responsible for the things that happen to other people. What we do as people affects other people. And just because we don't like something, doesn't mean we have to be bad people about it. And you want to think about linking this to modern situations. So for example, there are lots of, I'm sure you'll see it on the news, some people agree with having asylum seekers in this country, and some people don't agree with having asylum seekers in this country. And there are things like, obviously you'll see all these things about race on the TV as well. So some people are saying there's no racism in this country, and some people are saying there is racism in this country. And you'll actually see a lot of the behaviours that the Burlings have happen in this day and age as well. Now, whether you want to be a socialist or a capitalist or whatever you want to agree with, I want you to really start thinking about what behaviours we're seeing there. When you're told, this person just wanted to have a good life, and you're saying, yeah, but I don't care because it was slightly inconvenient to me. We're sat there and we're thinking, but what if you were that person? So what if Sheila was Eva Smith? Would Mr. Burling want her treated the same way Eva Smith was? Just because you're not lower class doesn't mean all the lower classes are worthless. Just because you're not of a different race, or you're not an asylum seeker, or you're not etc., doesn't mean your feelings, it doesn't mean that their feelings are worthless because they're not the same as you. And that's what the inspector's trying to say here. There's nothing wrong with community. There's nothing wrong with actually saying, okay, let's share a little. And that's what the inspector's trying to say, okay? So, whether you have different opinions and whether you think capitalism is right, which you're perfectly entitled to say, that you think capitalism is correct, what Priestley is trying to say is he believes that if we all started being a little bit more considerate to our fellow human being, then these situations wouldn't happen. And that's what Priestley is really pointing at. And you've got to think, though, these are all behaviours that happen in today's society. It's not my fault that things are going wrong because I didn't start it. Well, no, but did you do anything in the process to help end it? Mrs. Burling, yes, she wasn't the reason that the girl needed help, but she chose not to help her. So doesn't that make her just as responsible as everyone else? Remember the chain of events. Every single one of them links to a chain. If you can break the chain at some point, you can potentially save a person's life, if you give them help. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a big help. It could just be a little tiny bit of help, and you might be the person who changes that person's life. And who cares if they're lower class? Who cares if they're black or white or any other race or from any other country? what the inspector is trying to say is just treat a person like a person. And that's what he's trying to come to here. So, you know, I'm pretty sure even if you disagree with socialism, I'm pretty sure you can even sort of see that, you know, at least treat someone like a person, at least. Hopefully we can all see that's what the inspector's saying here. And, you know, these things will happen in human history, and it's quite difficult, and they're still happening now, but it's good that we can sort of read into what Priestley's message is, because we can apply it. And now we wouldn't apply it to modern day society in our exam, but obviously doing that now, it'll help us to understand it a little bit more. So the inspector actually says you started it. She wanted to Mr. Burling, she wanted 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and sixpence. It's not a massive pay rise she was asking for. You made her pay a heavy price for that, and now she'll make you pay a heavier price still. So what the inspector is actually talking about here is the price being money, the price being not money, sorry. So Mr. Burling always thinks a price is money, but actually what the inspector's pointing out is that, you know, we need to stop caring so much about money, and we need to start realising that actually our own conscience is really important. Can we look at ourselves in the mirror? Can we live with ourselves? Can we honestly say that we treat other people like they are human beings? And Burling then says, look, Inspector, I would give thousands, yes, thousands. So he's almost saying here, I didn't want to give money at the time, but now I know there's a consequence, I'll give money. Rather than just being a decent person from the start. So I want you to write that down, why the inspector's thinking this is wrong now. You're offering the money at the wrong time, Mr. Burling. So he's saying here, you know, you could have fixed this before. So you can't fix it now by just throwing money at a problem, but you could have fixed it before by being reasonable and a decent human being. No, I don't think any of you will forget, nor that young man Croft, though he at least had some affection for her, made her happy for a time. Well, Eva's gone, and you can't do her any more harm now, and you can't do her any good now either. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. So I want you to look at the next part. This part is such a good speech. But just remember this, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. Okay, so breaking that down, what he's saying here is Eva Smith is a particularly generic name. So Eva, like Eve, the first woman. Smith is the most common surname in the UK. John, the most common first name in the UK at the time. Smith, the most common last name in the UK at the time. What he's saying here is that it's not just Eva Smith that you failed. Eva Smith represents all of these working class women who've been mistreated. So right now, he's not talking about this one person, he's talking symbolically about the whole of the lower class, and he's calling them Eva Smith and John Smith, meaning men and women. So all of the Eva Smiths and the John Smiths, all of the working class men and women are still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with our lives. So look at the way he uses that word intertwined. So that's that's sort of symbolic, again, write down symbolism. That's symbolic of the fact that people need to stop looking at everything like it's isolated. We need to stop looking at things like it's us versus them. We need to stop looking at things as though, you know, we're really, really separate from other people. And we need to start looking at things as though we're all a community. And that's what he's saying here with that word intertwined. It symbolizes community. We need to stop looking at ourselves as separate. With our lives and what we think and say and do. So our actions need to help everyone, not just ourselves. We don't live alone, we are members of one body. So one body is a metaphor, and I want you to write that down. So we are members of one body, which basically means that if you don't take care of all parts of your body doesn't function, right? So if I say to you, okay, what's the one thing that's the most important organ in the body? You'd probably say the brain and the heart, okay? So let's say that the upper class see themselves as the brain and the heart, and they see the working class as a lesser organ, like the kidney or the skin. And then we think to ourselves, okay, well, if we don't take care of our kidneys, we go into kidney failure and we die. if we don't take care of our skin and we go outside and get sunburn every day, then we get skin cancer and we die. So what the inspector is trying to say is, you can't say that any part of a community is not important, because a community needs to work together. In the same way that Mr. Burling couldn't be a factory owner unless the working class were willing to work for him. So Mr. Burling can't survive without the working class. And the working class can't survive without Mr. Burling, you know, employing them, you know, bringing in business. So we need to all work together, and we need to stop seeing ourselves as so separate. Okay, so we're all members of one body. We are responsible for each other, and I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So if you look at those three words, fire and blood and anguish, this is dramatic irony here. And what Priestley is foreshadowing is the World War. Okay, so the World Wars, World War I and World War II, that were going to happen after 1912. Blood and fire and anguish. These are three things that are associated with war. Anguish meaning incredible pain. So what he's saying here is that if you keep doing what you're doing, you will cause war. And the reason that Priestley thinks that is he actually fought in World War I. And most of the people killed in World War I were working class men. And when they came back, there was a massive, when they didn't come back, sorry, there was a massive shortage of people to work on farms and people to work in factories, and the UK economy struggled to bounce back. And the same thing happened in World War II. People were on rations. And what he's saying here is, if we keep treating other people badly, and we keep starting these wars and sending all these working class men to die, then actually we'll end up learning our lesson. We'll end up learning that our behaviour is wrong, but it will take blood, fire and anguish to do that. And after World War II, we finally had more socialism in place, and that's what Priestley was trying to promote here, that socialism should have come in a lot sooner. We finally had the NHS. And that was the biggest socialist movement in this country, arguably, where people actually were able to have free healthcare. So, you know, it becomes a really interesting point, a really interesting place to sort of start looking. Because basically Priestley is saying we should have changed this a lot sooner. We should have changed this in 1912. And he leaves them, and then he leaves them after that. That's his last word. Okay, so I want you to make sure that page 56 is annotated, and then you've got Act 3, page 56. The task: how does the inspector's speech use dramatic irony in order to be effective? How does the inspector use emotive language? How does the inspector use metaphors to show the need for social responsibility, meaning everyone in society being responsible? And the task: I believe the inspector is there to warn the Burling family that they need to change their ways, otherwise they will regret it. How does what I've said sort of support that? You know, to what extent do you agree? Can any quotes here support that point? Explain why you think Priestley could have done that as well. Okay, so start thinking about that.